Don't touch me. People like you should stay invisible. The words didn't just land. They echoed, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the soft hum of clinking glasses and low jazz that filled the upscale Manhattan restaurant perched 20 floors above the city. For a moment, everything slowed. Forks paused midair. Conversations thinned into whispers. And at the center of it all stood Naomi Brooks, a black waitress in a crisp white shirt and black apron, her hand still hovering inches above a crystal glass she had just set down. She didn't pull back right away. She didn't apologize. She didn't move. Across the room, seated at a private corner table beneath a warm amber light, Ethan Caldwell watched. He didn't lean forward. He didn't speak. He simply observed, his fingers resting lightly against the rim of a half-finished glass of bourbon that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. To anyone else, it looked like indifference. But Ethan wasn't a man who missed details. Not in boardrooms. Not in life. And certainly not here. Naomi lowered her hand slowly, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The man in front of her, a well-dressed guest with a voice too loud for the room, shifted in his chair, clearly expecting something. An apology. A retreat. A confirmation of the invisible role he had already assigned her. Around them, the restaurant shimmered with quiet wealth. Marble floors reflected soft golden light. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline like a painting of power and ambition. This was a place where deals were made in whispers and respect was measured in dollars. And in spaces like this, people like Naomi were expected to blend into the background, to exist without presence, to serve without voice. But something in her didn't fold. Something held. Ethan noticed that first. Not the tension. Not the insult. The stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from fear, but from control. Naomi's eyes lifted, meeting the man's gaze. Not with defiance, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling. Certainty. It was subtle, easy to miss. But Ethan saw it, because he had built an empire recognizing moments exactly like this. The quiet seconds before everything changed. He set his glass down. Not loudly. Just enough for the ice inside to shift with a soft crack. And still, he said nothing. Not yet. Because some moments reveal more when you let them breathe. And right now, Naomi Brooks was no longer just a waitress in a crowded room. She was something else entirely. And whether anyone realized it or not, the balance in that room had already begun to shift. The man let out a short laugh. The kind that was not meant to be funny but to remind everyone who he thought held the power. "Did you not hear me?" he said, louder this time, his voice stretching across nearby tables. "I said do not touch my glass." Naomi did not step back. She did not shrink. Instead, she adjusted the edge of the linen napkin with slow precision, as if the world had not just tilted toward her. "Sir," she said calmly, her voice even, steady enough to cut through the tension without raising itself. "I was placing your order exactly where you asked." There was no apology in her tone. No hesitation. Just fact. The difference was subtle, but in a room trained to detect weakness, it landed like a disruption. A few guests exchanged glances. Someone shifted in their chair. The man's smile tightened, no longer effortless. "You people always have an answer, do not you?" he replied, leaning back slightly, his words dressed in politeness but lined with something colder. Naomi held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than expected. Not challenging, not submissive, just present. "I have respect for my job," she said. "And for this room." It was not what he wanted. It was not the script. The air changed again, quieter this time, heavier. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition. He had seen negotiations collapse for less. He had seen executives crumble under pressure that looked almost identical to this. The difference was, those men wore tailored suits and carried titles. Naomi carried a tray. And yet, the control in her voice, the discipline in her stillness, it mirrored something far more familiar to him than the arrogance echoing from the guest. The man tapped, his fingers against the table, searching for footing. "Maybe next time," he said, his voice sharpening. "You should remember your place." There it was. The line that usually ended conversations. The line that closed doors. The line that most people accepted without question. Naomi inhaled slowly, not visibly, but enough for the shift to register in the subtle rise of her shoulders. She did not look away. She did not rush to respond. For a fraction of a second, the room seemed to wait with her. Then she spoke. "My place," she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the words, "is to do my job with professionalism, not to be spoken to without it." It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was enough. A quiet boundary drawn in a space where boundaries like hers were rarely acknowledged. A chair scraped faintly somewhere behind them. A glass was set down too quickly. Small sounds, but they carried. The man's expression flickered, just for a moment, something slipping through the confidence he had worn so easily before. Not defeat. Not yet. But uncertainty. And uncertainty, in rooms like this, was the beginning of loss. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his attention now fully anchored. He had come here expecting another predictable night of deals and controlled conversations. Instead, he was watching something far more rare unfold in real time. Not a confrontation, not an argument, a shift. And as Naomi stood there, steady and unshaken, it became clear that whatever happened next would not follow the rules this room was used to. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, like air before a storm, stretching across the polished room as people leaned just slightly closer without meaning to, drawn by something they could not quite name. And Naomi felt it too, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that sharpens rather than shakes, the kind that reminds you exactly who you are when someone tries to decide it for you. And across from her the man shifted again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if recalibrating. As if the version of her he had already placed in his mind no longer fit the person standing in front of him. "You are overstepping," he said, quieter now but tighter, his words no longer filling the room the way they had before, and Naomi did not rush to answer. She let the space sit, let the weight of his tone settle and pass. Then she spoke with the same calm precision. "No, sir, I am standing where I have been this entire time." And something about that landed differently. Not confrontational, not defensive, just anchored. And that was what unsettled him most, because it left no angle to push against, no weakness to exploit. And for a brief second his eyes flicked away, scanning the room as if searching for agreement, for support, for someone to quietly reinforce the hierarchy he was used to. But what he found instead was attention, silent, observant, waiting. And attention without agreement is a dangerous thing in places built on perception. A woman at a nearby table lowered her glass slowly. Another guest straightened in his seat, not intervening, not speaking, but no longer dismissing. And in that subtle shift the room began to reorganize itself, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. And from the corner, Ethan Caldwell watched the pattern unfold with the same focus he reserved for high-stakes decisions, his mind not rushing ahead, but tracing each detail as it revealed itself. The measured cadence of Naomi's voice, the discipline in her restraint, the way she allowed silence to work for her instead of against her. And it struck him not as coincidence, but as training, not the kind learned in service, but the kind forged somewhere else entirely, because people do not arrive at that level of control by accident. And as that thought settled, something else followed behind it, quieter, more personal, recognition without confirmation, a sense that this moment was not as simple as it appeared. And back at the table the man exhaled sharply through his nose, a small sound but one that carried the edge of someone losing control of a situation he expected to dominate. "You should be careful," he said, leaning forward slightly now, his voice no longer confident enough to be loud. "People notice attitudes like that." And Naomi met his gaze again, steady as before. "I believe people notice how others are treated," she replied, and this time the words did not just land, they lingered, echoing in the quiet spaces between tables. And somewhere behind them a server paused mid-step. Another guest set down a fork that had hovered too long, and the room held its breath in that strange, suspended way that only happens when something real begins to surface beneath something polished. And Ethan finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with intention, his chair shifting back just enough to signal a change. Not yet an interruption, not yet a decision, but the first visible sign that the balance in the room had shifted far enough to demand one. The faint scrape of Ethan Caldwell's chair did not echo loudly, but it carried with it a shift that rippled far deeper than sound, the kind of movement that people in that room were trained to notice even when they pretended not to. and one by one, subtle as breath, heads turned just slightly in his direction, not out of curiosity, but out of instinct, because power rarely announces itself. It simply changes the way a room listens. And Ethan did not rush forward. He did not raise his voice. He simply took a step, then another, each measured, each unhurried, his presence threading through the space with quiet authority until he stood just within the edge of the moment that had already begun to redefine itself. And the man at the table noticed immediately, his posture tightening, his expression shifting from irritation to something more cautious, something calculating, because even without knowing exactly why, he understood that the balance had tipped beyond his control, and Naomi felt it too, not as rescue, not as relief, but as observation, as if the room itself had leaned in to see what she would do next, not what anyone else would do for her. And Ethan's gaze moved between them, not lingering, not judging, simply taking in what had already been said, what had already been revealed. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying just enough to be heard without ever needing to rise. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, not as an accusation, not as a demand, but as a question that carried weight precisely because it did not try to. And the man straightened quickly, smoothing the front of his jacket, his tone adjusting in an instant. "No problem at all," he said, a quick smile forming, thinner than before. "Just a small misunderstanding." And the word misunderstanding hung in the air, fragile, convenient, an attempt to shrink something that had already expanded beyond control. And Ethan did not respond right away. He let the silence return, not as tension this time, but as space, space that forced the truth to sit where it belonged, visible, undeniable. And then his eyes shifted to Naomi, not above her, not past her, but directly to her. And there was something different in that look, something precise, as if he were not just seeing her, but placing her, aligning her with something already known, already measured. And Naomi met his gaze the same way she had met the man's before, steady, grounded, unshaken. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke, but something passed between them anyway, something unspoken, something that did not belong to the room or the moment, something older, deeper. And the man at the table cleared his throat lightly, trying to reclaim control. "Like I said," he added, forcing a small chuckle, "nothing worth interrupting your evening over." And that was when Ethan finally moved again, not toward the man, but slightly to the side, shifting his position just enough to change the dynamic completely, because now he was no longer observing the situation, he was part of it. And yet, he still did not confront, did not correct, did not declare. Instead, he asked a second question, softer than the first, but sharper in its intent. "Then perhaps," he said, his eyes still on Naomi, "we should make sure everyone in this room is being treated with the same level of respect." And it was not a statement, not exactly, but it did not need to be, because the implications settled instantly, quietly, like a truth that had been waiting for permission to exist. And around them, the room did not react outwardly. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements, but something had undeniably shifted again, deeper this time, more permanent. And the man's smile faltered just enough to reveal the crack beneath it, because in that single sentence, Ethan had not taken Naomi's place, had not spoken for her, had not rewritten what she had already established. He had simply acknowledged it. And in doing so, he had changed the rules of the room without ever needing to say so. And Naomi, standing exactly where she had been from the beginning, did not move, did not soften, did not look away, because she understood something now, that the room was only beginning to realize. This was no longer about a single moment. It was about what came after, and what Ethan Caldwell would choose to reveal next. The words did not echo loudly, but they settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored. And for a moment no one moved, not because they were unsure of what had been said, but because they understood exactly what it meant. And the man at the table shifted again, this time slower, his confidence no longer effortless, his posture adjusting as if he were trying to realign himself with a version of the room that no longer existed. "Of course," he said, forcing a small nod. "Respect goes both ways." But the sentence did not land the way he intended. It felt thinner now, like something rehearsed rather than believed, and Ethan did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch just enough to allow the contrast to become visible, because in rooms like this, truth rarely needs to be spoken loudly. It only needs to be left unprotected. And then, without raising his voice, Ethan turned slightly toward Naomi again, his attention precise, intentional. "You handled that well," he said, and the statement was simple, almost understated, but it carried something far more significant than praise. It was recognition, and recognition, in a space built on hierarchy, was currency. Naomi did not smile. She did not lower her gaze. She simply nodded once. "I handled my responsibility," she replied, her tone as steady as before, and for a fraction of a second, something almost like approval flickered in Ethan's expression, subtle, controlled, but real, because what he was seeing was not performance, not defiance. For the sake of attention, it was discipline, the kind that cannot be taught in a single moment, the kind that reveals itself only under pressure. And behind them, the quiet tension in the room began to shift into something else, not relief, not yet, but awareness, a collective understanding that something had just unfolded that did not follow the usual script. And the man at the table cleared his throat again, softer this time, less certain. "Look," he said, adjusting his cuff as if the movement might restore his composure. "I did not mean anything by it." And there it was, the retreat, not an apology, but a repositioning, an attempt to step back without admitting the step had been taken too far. Naomi listened without interrupting, without reacting, because she understood something that most people in that room were only beginning to grasp, that not every response requires a reply. Sometimes silence is the final boundary, and Ethan watched that exchange closely, not because of what was being said, but because of what was not, the restraint, the control, the refusal to engage in a cycle that would only diminish the clarity she had already established. And then, almost as if concluding a thought he had been forming since the moment he stood up, Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, and he withdrew a slim, dark card, holding it between his fingers for a brief second before placing it gently on the edge of the table, not in front of the man, but closer to Naomi. The placement subtle but unmistakable, and the shift that followed was immediate, not loud, not visible in any obvious way, but it traveled through the room like recognition passing from one person to another, because those who understood what that gesture meant did not need it explained, and those who did not could feel its significance anyway. And the man's eyes dropped to the card, his expression tightening just slightly. Curiosity replaced by something closer to unease, because whatever control he believed he held had now been quietly redefined. And Naomi glanced down at the card for only a moment before looking back at Ethan, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharper now, more focused, because this was no longer just about a single exchange. This was about something unfolding beneath it, something that had been building long before this moment. And Ethan, meeting her gaze again, spoke just once more, his voice calm, measured, carrying only as far as it needed to. "I believe," he said, "you already know how to use that." And in that single sentence, the room shifted again, deeper this time, because whatever he had just revealed, it was not meant for everyone, but it was enough to change everything. Naomi's eyes rested on the card for a fraction longer this time, not out of hesitation, but recognition, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that settles quietly into place as pieces align. And she reached for it with steady fingers, not quickly, not cautiously, simply with intention, lifting it just enough to see the surface catch the soft amber light. And for a brief second, the room seemed to lean closer again, drawn not by movement, but by meaning, because whatever that card represented, it had already changed the way the moment was unfolding. And Naomi did not react outwardly. She did not widen her eyes or shift her posture. She simply turned it once between her fingers, as if confirming something she had already known, then placed it back down exactly where it had been, her gaze returning to Ethan with the same calm clarity that had carried her through everything before. "I do," she said, her voice quiet, but unmistakably certain. And that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just two words that landed with a weight far greater than their size. And the man at the table frowned slightly, confusion now replacing the thin layer of confidence he had been trying to rebuild. "You do what?" he asked, his tone no longer sharp, but uncertain, searching for footing in a conversation that had clearly moved beyond him, and neither of them answered him right away. Because the answer was not meant for him, not directly, and Ethan allowed that silence to settle. Once more, not as tension, but as confirmation, before he finally spoke again. This time not to Naomi, but to the space itself. That card, he said evenly, is not given out lightly. And the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried with them a context that began to ripple outward. Because in rooms like this, objects do not hold value on their own. People assign it. And Ethan Caldwell was not a man known for casual gestures. And Naomi did not interrupt. She did not explain. Because she understood the power of letting others arrive at the truth on their own. And the man shifted again, glancing between them, his expression tightening as realization began to form in uneven pieces. "What is this supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority it once carried. And Ethan turned his attention toward him briefly, not dismissively, but without urgency. "It means," he said, "that not everyone in this room is who you assume they are." And the sentence did not rise, did not demand. It simply existed, and that made it impossible to ignore. And across the room, the subtle tension that had been building began to transform into something else entirely: curiosity, awareness, a quiet recalibration of perception as people reconsidered what they thought they understood. And Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, because for her, nothing had shifted, not internally, not in identity, only externally, in how the room was beginning to see her. And Ethan watched that too, the way she did. Not step into the attention, did not claim it, did not use it to elevate herself, but simply allowed it to exist without altering who she was. And that, more than anything else, confirmed what he had already begun to suspect, that this was not a moment creating something new. It was revealing something that had always been there. And the man exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the ambient music returning in soft notes around them. "So what?" he said, attempting once more to reclaim some version of control, though it no longer fit him the same way. "She is not just a waitress." And Ethan's gaze returned to Naomi, not answering for her, not speaking over her, but acknowledging the question, without needing to define it. And Naomi, after a brief pause, spoke again, her voice steady, grounded, unchanged. "I am exactly what I need to be in this moment," she said. And there was no arrogance in it, no challenge, just truth. And in that truth, something settled across the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because the story that had begun as something small, something dismissible, had now become something far more difficult to ignore. And whatever Ethan Caldwell was about to reveal next, it was no longer just about a card, or a title, or a position. It was about the quiet power of someone who never needed any of those things to stand exactly where she belonged. The words did not rise, but they carried, settling into the room with a quiet authority that made people listen without knowing why. And for a moment no one responded, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had just been said left no easy way to answer. And Ethan Caldwell watched Naomi with a focus that had shifted from curiosity to confirmation. Because in that single sentence, she had done something most executives failed to do under far less pressure. She had defined her position without asking for permission. And that was not something he overlooked, not in business, not in people. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded once, not as approval, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. And then he turned slightly, his attention widening to include the man at the table again, whose posture had now lost the last traces of certainty it once held. "You asked what it means," Ethan said, his tone even, measured, as if he were clarifying a detail in a contract rather than reshaping the entire dynamic of the room. "It means you made an assumption." And he paused, just long enough for the words to settle. "And you built your behavior on it." The sentence was simple, almost plain, but it carried a weight that pressed quietly against the edges of the man's composure. And the man attempted a small laugh, one that did not quite reach his eyes. "Everyone makes assumptions," he replied, his voice softer now, less certain. "That does not make this a situation." And Ethan did not interrupt. He allowed the words to finish, because sometimes letting someone hear themselves is more revealing than correcting them. And then he stepped just slightly closer, not in confrontation, but in clarity. "No," he said, "it makes it a choice." And the distinction landed, clean and precise, cutting through the last layer of deflection the man had been holding onto. And around them, the room did not react loudly. But the shift was undeniable. Conversations that had paused now remained. Paused, attention that had flickered now stayed fixed, because something about the moment had moved beyond discomfort into recognition. And Naomi remained exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, allowing the truth of the situation to unfold without needing to guide it, because she had already done her part. And Ethan, turning back toward her for just a moment, reached again into his jacket, this time slower, more deliberate, and he withdrew a second card, nearly identical to the first, but not quite, placing it gently beside the one already on the table. The gesture small, controlled, but unmistakable in its intent, and a quiet murmur passed through a few nearby tables, not loud enough to break the atmosphere, but enough to signal that those who understood had begun to connect the pieces, because one card could be a gesture, a test, a moment, but two suggested something else entirely, something established, something intentional, and the man's eyes moved between the cards, then back to Ethan, his expression tightening with a realization he could not fully articulate. "What are you doing?" he asked, the question no longer demanding, but searching, and Ethan did not answer immediately. He let the silence return once more, not as tension, but as space for the truth to settle fully into place, before finally speaking with a calm that carried more weight than volume ever could. "I am correcting the room," he said, and then, after a brief pause, his gaze returning to Naomi, and acknowledging what was already here before any of us noticed. And in that moment, the dynamic shifted for the final time, not dramatically, not loudly, but definitively, because whatever had been invisible before was no longer unseen, and Naomi, standing with the same steady composure she had held from the beginning, did not change, because she did not need to. The room had finally caught up to her. The words did not echo, but they settled into the room like a final piece sliding into place. And for a moment no one moved, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that whatever had just been revealed could not be undone. And the man at the table sat back slowly, his fingers no longer tapping, his posture no longer searching for control, because control had already left him, not taken, not forced, simply removed by the weight of truth he could not argue with. And across from him Naomi remained steady, unchanged, her presence now carrying a quiet gravity that had nothing to do with the cards on the table and everything to do with how she had stood long before they appeared. And Ethan Caldwell watched the room absorb it, not with satisfaction, not with pride, but with the same measured awareness he brought to every turning point in his life, because this was never about creating a moment. It was about revealing one that had already earned its place. And then, without raising his voice, without shifting his stance, he spoke again, his tone calm, precise. "3 months ago," he began, and the subtle shift in the room was immediate, attention tightening, curiosity sharpening, because this was no longer about implication, it was about explanation. "A consulting report crossed my desk," he continued, his eyes moving briefly toward Naomi before returning to the space as a whole. "Anonymous submission, no credentials attached, just analysis." And the man at the table frowned slightly, confusion replacing what little certainty he had left, while others leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the shift from present tension to past revelation. And Ethan did not rush. He allowed each word to land fully. "It identified inefficiencies in one of my company's largest divisions, projected losses within 12 months, and proposed a restructuring plan that not only corrected the issue but increased projected revenue by 17%. And a quiet murmur passed through the room, subtle but unmistakable, because numbers like that did not go unnoticed in places like this. And Naomi did not react, did not move, her gaze steady, as if she had already heard this before. And Ethan continued, his voice unchanged. "My executive team could not replicate it, could not trace it, could not improve it," he said, pausing briefly. "So I did something I rarely do. And here, just for a fraction of a second, something almost like reflection. crossed his expression, I started looking for the person behind it. And the room held its breath again, not dramatically, but collectively, because now the direction was clear, and the man at the table glanced at Naomi once more, his expression tightening with realization that was arriving too late to matter, and Ethan's gaze returned to her fully now, not as an observer, not as a participant, but as someone confirming what had already been established. I found patterns, he said, language, structure, perspective, and then, after a brief pause that carried more weight than any raised voice could, he added, and tonight, I found confirmation, and the silence that followed was deeper than anything before it, not empty, but full of understanding, full of recalibration, full of the quiet recognition that the story they thought they were witnessing had never been what it appeared to be, and Naomi, standing exactly where she had always been, did not step into the moment, did not claim it, did not reshape herself to fit it, because she did not need to. The truth had already done that for her, and the room, for the first time that night, was no longer deciding who she was. It was catching up to who she had been all along. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt complete, as if the room itself had reached a point it could not return from. And for the first time that night, no one was waiting for someone else to speak first, because the truth had already taken its place, and it did not need to be defended, explained, or repeated. And Naomi Brooks stood exactly where she had begun, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, not elevated by what had been revealed, not altered by what had been recognized, because none of it had created her value. It had only uncovered it. And Ethan Caldwell watched her for a moment longer, not as a test, not as a question, but as confirmation of something he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge so quickly, that sometimes the clearest understanding of a person comes not from interviews or credentials, but from the way they carry themselves when no one believes they need to. And then, without any sense of ceremony, he reached forward and gently slid the two cards closer to her, not offering them, not presenting them, simply placing them where they belonged, within her reach, within her control, and his voice, when it came again, was quieter than before, but more certain. I do not offer opportunities, he said. I recognize them. And the distinction settled into the space between them, deliberate, unmistakable. And Naomi glanced at the cards once more, then back at him, her gaze unwavering, not impressed, not intimidated, simply present. And for a brief moment, the world outside the windows, the skyline, the movement, the distant lights, seemed irrelevant, because everything that mattered in that moment was contained within the quiet understanding forming between two people who did not need to prove anything to one another. And behind them, the man who had started it all sat still, no longer attempting to speak, no longer searching for a way to reclaim something that had already been lost, because this was not about winning or losing. It was about seeing, and once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. And around the room, conversations began again, slowly at first, then more naturally, but different now, quieter, more aware, as if the space itself had adjusted its standards without announcing it. And Naomi reached down, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the same steady control she had carried from the beginning, and she picked up the cards, holding them for a brief second before placing them neatly into the pocket of her apron, not as a trophy, not as a prize, but as something practical, something earned, something that did not need to be displayed to be understood. And Ethan gave a slight nod, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement, before stepping back, returning to his place without waiting for thanks, without expecting recognition, because he had not intervened to change the outcome. He had simply allowed the truth to be seen clearly enough that it could not be ignored. And Naomi turned, not away from the moment, but through it, continuing her work with the same quiet precision she had always carried, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And in a way, nothing had, because the most powerful part of the night was not the reveal, not the reaction, not the shift in the room. It was the fact that she had never needed any of it to stand exactly where she belonged. And as the lights continued to glow softly against polished glass and quiet conversations resumed their rhythm, one truth remained, steady and unshaken. Power can fill a room, but dignity defines it.